ministers of the 1960s. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was born on September 18, 1895 in Newstall, Ontario, and died on August 6, 1979 in Ottawa. Diefenbaker received his education at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. Later, he was part of the political party, the Progressive Conservatives of Canada. He was the 13th Prime Minister of Canada and served from June 21, 1957 to April 22, 1963. John served in the Canadian Corps during the First World War. After his years of service, he attended university in the prairies of Saskatchewan. Following his schooling, he became a defense lawyer who was very well known. At this point, he started to get involved in politics. John ran for the mayor of Prince Albert 6 times, but unfortunately lost every time. Despite the fact that he was one of Saskatchewan's biggest lawyers, he still wanted to engage in a career of politics. In 1936, he became the leader of the Conservative Party of Saskatchewan. In June 1939, Diefenbaker was nominated for the federal riding of Lake Centre, and in March 1940, he was elected Conservative Member of Parliament. Because of his background in law, he had a reputation as an astute questioner to the opposition. He was re-elected for Lake Centre in 1945 and 1949. In 1956, Diefenbaker was chosen to succeed George Drew, who had resigned as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. The following year, Diefenbaker led his party to an upset victory over the Liberals, led by Louis Saint Laurent, and formed a minority government, the first Conservative government since that of R.B. Bennett. In March 1958, the electorate returned his government with a huge majority of 208 seats. Diefenbaker was known for non-establishment. He was a supporter of civil rights for all, and Diefenbaker championed the Canadian Bill of Rights and the extension of the vote to First Nations. He also played an important role in the anti-apartheid statement that led to South Africa's departure from the Commonwealth in 1961, but he was heavily criticized for the shutdown of Avro Arrow. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson was born on April 23, 1897 in Newton Brook, Ontario. He died on December 27, 1972 in Ottawa, Canada. Pearson received his education at Columbia University, the Peterborough Collegiate, and the University of Toronto. He was involved in the Liberal Party of Canada and became the 14th Prime Minister of Canada. He served from 1963 to 1968. Pearson participated in the First World War. He was hired by the University of Toronto to teach history, which he combined with tennis and coaching football. Pearson joined the Department of External Affairs, now Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development. By 1928, he had trained himself as a perceptive observer and an able writer. In 1935, he was sent to London as First Secretary in the Canadian High Commission, giving him a front-row seat as Europe drifted towards the Second World War. Pearson returned to Canada in 1941. He was sent to Washington as second-in-command at the Canadian Legation in 1942, where his easygoing personality and personal charm made him a great success, particularly with the press. In 1945, he was named Canadian Ambassador to the United States and attended the founding conference of the United Nations. Pearson's work culminated in Canada's joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. In September 1948, he became Minister of External Affairs. As minister, he helped lead Canada into the Korean War as a contributor to the UN Army, and in 1952 served as President of the UN General Assembly, where he tried to find a solution to the conflict. His biggest achievement was in 1956, where he was one of the major forces that ended the Suez Canal crisis. He later received a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Pearson took office on the 22nd of April, 1963. Pearson was Canada's biggest diplomat of the 1950s and 60s and formulated its basic post-World War II foreign policy. Pearson's government implemented a Canada Pension Plan, a universal Medicare system, a unified armed force, and a new flag. Prime Minister Trudeau was born on October 18, 1919 in Montreal, Canada. He died on September 28, 2000 in Montreal. Trudeau received his education at Le Collège Jean de Brébeuf, School of Economics, and later became a part of the Liberal Party of Canada. He was the 15th Prime Minister of Canada and served from 1968 to 79 and 1980 to 1984. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a politician, writer, constitutional lawyer, and a charismatic and controversial figure. Trudeau was arguably Canada's best-known politician. He was instrumental in getting Canada's constitutional independence from the British Parliament and establishing a new Canadian constitution with an entrenched Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Trudeau also brought in the Official Languages Act in 1969, making Canada officially bilingual. While he played an important role in defeating the Quebec sovereigntists movement, in the 1970s and 1980s, his federalist stance as well as his language and economic policies alienated many in Canada, particularly in the Western provinces. Overall, Trudeau's career as Prime Minister was one of electoral success. He served longer than every other contemporary leader in the Western world, becoming the elder statesman of the West. His achievements include the 1980 defeat of Quebec separatism, official bilingualism, the Patriotic Constitution, and the Charter of Rights. The 1960s Canadian flag debate. Lester B. Pearson was one who proposed the idea for the new national flag in the House of Commons. The national flag debate began on February 15, 1965. The parliamentary debate on our Canadian national flag was a long and tedious one. It took a matter of 37 sitting days, all filled with lectures and speeches. The Conservative Party made 210 speeches, the Liberals 50, the NDPs 24, the Social Credit 15, and the Creditistes 9. At a certain point in the debate, Pearson eventually used the rules of closure, and it was said that the speeches were cut down to a 20-minute maximum to be able to proceed with the rest of the debate. There were approximately 5,900 alternative designs for thought on the look of a new flag. The vote on the design of the new flag was taken on December 15, 1964. And the committee's recommendation was accepted 163 to 78. Canada's flag was officially hoisted on the Peace Tower on February 15, 1965. Prime Minister Diefenbaker died in 1979, and his coffin was draped with both the ensign and the new flag. Fashion in the 1960s. The fashion trends in Canada were huge during the 1960s. Although not all trends originally came from Canada, many Canadians loved keeping up with the style that was occurring all over the world. Women had many fashion trends in the 60s. There was the hippie, the mod, also known as modernists, the rock stars, and a few more. Hippies were usually the calm and easygoing people. They usually bought clothes secondhand or made the clothes themselves, usually wearing jeans. Being a mod was for both men and women. Men started the trend, and later women became involved. Mods took clothing very seriously. Their outfit was their first priority. Some trends, usually worn by mods, were ribbed turtlenecks, go-go boots, shift dresses, miniskirts, and leather jackets. Rockstars were often looked upon as tough people, or the bad kids. They usually rode motorcycles, and they had a more relaxed outfit compared to the mods. Rockstars usually wore a black leather jacket, jeans, black leather boots, and white socks. Men's fashion in the 60s included ties, belts, wider lapels, collars, and a longer and wider version of bell bottoms called flared. Sports shirts and sweaters were also the norm for men to wear. Men also went through a mod and rockster trend. Fashion was a huge deal for the teenagers in Canada during the 60s, as the baby boomers were introduced to new styles from all over the world. Since there was no war going on, it made it easier for Canadians to see their favorite celebrities and what they were wearing. It also made it easier for Canada to keep up with the trends that were happening all over the world. Even though there were no specific fashion trends that took place in Canada, Canadians had adapted to the trends occurring all over the world. Music in the 1960s. There were many famous Canadian artists and bands of the 1960s that have worldwide hits still known today. Some examples of famous Canadian artists are Steppenwolf and Andy Kim. These Canadian artists have impacted the music industry not only in Canada, but in the entire world. Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf is a Canadian band with members John Kay as lead singer, Goldie McJohn, keyboard player, Jerry Edmonton, the drummer, and Nick St. Nicholas, bass player. The band first started as the Sparrows, playing concerts and small gigs around Ontario. They got very popular after they played a gig at the Hawk's Nest in Toronto. After that night, they started getting jobs everywhere, and they changed their band name to Steppenwolf. Shortly after, in 1968, they released one of their most famous singles, Born to be Wild. Andy Kim. Andrew Yuka Kim, also known as Andy Kim, was a singer, songwriter, and producer in the 60s. He and his family lived in Montreal, Canada, where they ran a grocery store. Ever since he was young, he had a strong passion for music. When Andrew turned 16, he left home and went to New York City, hoping that he could make it big. He wrote a few songs for some producers, but producer Jeff Berry was the most impressed with how good a songwriter Andrew was. When Andrew showed him his song, How'd We Ever Get This Way, he was so impressed that he got Andrew to sign a contract with Steed Records, which was the company Jeff Berry produced. Once his song was produced, Andrew changed his name to Andy Kim, and his song became one of the top 20 hits both in the United States and Canada in 1968. That same year, Andy released one of his hit singles, Sugar Sugar. Music was important to Canadians because it was a way for people to forget all of the terrifying memories of World War II and think of something more positive. Music was also important to all teenagers and younger kids during the 60s, as this was a generation of baby boomers who took up most of the population, so it kept many kids entertained. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place on October 16, 1962 to October 28, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This was the point in the war where the two superpowers came closest to a nuclear conflict. It was considered unique in a number of ways. Calculations and mixed calculations, hidden communication methods, silent techniques, and other miscommunications that led to faults and mishaps. But having approached the brink of nuclear conflict, both superpowers had begun to reconsider the nuclear arms race and took its first steps in agreeing to its first test ban treaty.